Hello, everyone. We're approaching what is perhaps more unusual, at least slightly unfamiliar, in the scholastic disputation. It at least is something very different from what we're accustomed to, and that difference is what I want to draw attention to in the beginning, because we're not accustomed to doing this sort of study. This is not the way in which we're accustomed to engaging our topics. We are more or less used to attending lectures, reading books, trying to get things down. You go and you take the tests or write papers and go on. But the scholastic approach and the medieval approach, what was for centuries canonical, was something quite different. But it's something that should be somewhat familiar to you in philosophic history. And I have in mind, of course, specifically Socrates. So Socratic dialectic consists of a kind of question and answer. So Socrates would propose, I don't really know something about this topic, but I hear that you do, so let me ask you, more about it, and, ask you a series of questions to hopefully put together a kind of theory between us, and then consider objections, and hopefully somewhere along the lines come to truth, or at least make some kind of progress, which of course is more than we can say for a lot of the Socratic dialogues. Nevertheless, this style of question and answer is something that's active, it's engaging, and to that point, Socrates specifically spoke against philosophic writing. Plato wrote against writing in his own voice. And so we have cause for wonder, is philosophy something that shouldn't be written? Is it something that should be an activity? Is philosophy essentially an activity? And I think we have a very good reason for doing this, and this is going to carry us straightforwardly into a consideration of why it is that something like the exercise of disputation is very valuable. And that is, when we're engaged in reading or listening to a lecture, we can think about what we're doing. But of course, you have the option not to. You have the option to simply passively go over words without necessarily digesting them. Much like being in a conversation for which you're not really obligated to respond. On the other hand, if all of a sudden you are obligated to respond, people expect you to talk, then you have to pay more attention to what's going on. It requires more conscious engagement with the subject. And indeed, trying to formulate your own thoughts, understand another's thoughts, is a process which helps to elucidate what it is that you're thinking. A similar sort of thing can be had in journaling and trying to, work out your ideas by way of writing. This is a very common philosophic practice, of course. So, what do I think about something? Well, let me find out. Let me start writing about it. And that may seem to be kind of a curious approach to it, saying, what do I think about something? Let me find out. As if I don't know beforehand, and I must find out by writing. But of course, there is something to this insofar as writing provides a kind of catalyst, a kind of stimulus, in the same way that conversation does, at least hopefully, and perhaps this is part of what Plato had in mind, that writing and engaged reading of this kind, perhaps, can involve one in a way that's similar to conversation, insofar as it puts demands on the mind so as to elicit more thinking, get you to explore more associations, put more energy really into the thought process in trying to explain yourself. So if you think simply, well, I understand X, whatever that might happen to be, then you may understand it, you may not, but you really don't know until you go forth and try and explain it. And this is one of the amusing things that if you've ever tried to teach at any level, then this is something that you find out very quickly. Do I know what I'm talking about or not? What's wonderful about this is that you'll find yourself saying and thinking things that you may not have previously thought, making associations that you haven't seen, making connections that you haven't understood before. And this is something that happens oftentimes not so much as a product of the stimulation that the other person is providing in the conversation in terms of the ideas that they bring to the table or things that they say, so much as their mere presence, forcing you to formulate in words and attempt to communicate an idea. When you're attempting merely to communicate with yourself, in the sense that you're just thinking through something, it's not clear that the entire exchange even needs to be verbal. So it's very easy to gloss over details. It's very easy to miss things. A mathematical approach to something necessitates a level of conscious engagement that is otherwise not always necessary when we are dealing with average things, prosaic arguments. We allow ourselves certain liberties in terms of glossing over assumptions and not necessarily understanding fully the logic of what we are saying or how each individual piece works when we are engaged in ordinary conversation. However, when we are trying to prove something mathematically, trying to derive a theorem, then we must pay much closer attention to the eccentricities of the logic, the details of exactly what is being said, exactly what is entailed, what can and can't be done according to the rules of the game. And so this kind of thinking, whereupon you have to apply a good deal of conscious resources just to be able to engage the material, that in itself also stimulates a kind of thought process, which can be very productive. It can be constructive and creative in a way that conversation as well, or writing, also can. Any attempt to formulate your thoughts formally into words can have this same kind of effect. Mathematics is merely the extreme form of this. And so the disputations are an exercise in formalizing things, to be sure, paying more attention to details of argument. Again, that's a very obvious and ostentatious part of what's going on, but also just to try and put things into words. And we get some of this with writing philosophic papers, but even more so when we are inclined to speak, because when we are speaking, there are different rules of rhetoric that we follow in terms of trying to make ourselves understood, especially when there's an interaction, because the interaction requires a dynamic in terms of engaging with the other person, not only in terms of explaining your idea, but also as far as the burden of responding to them, and responding to them not only as far as meeting their objections goes, but also in effort to try and hopefully help them to understand what it is that you're saying, to clearly formulate your side so much so that it is convincing, that the truth therein has a kind of force. Okay, so let's take a look at the anatomy of a written disputation. Now, I've recommended that you take a look at Thomas Aquinas' On Evil. So, the written forms of the disputations that we have in many of Aquinas' works, and a lot of the works from this period generally, follow this form, which is essentially the written form of the same kind of exercise that they would follow in the university. And so what we have is very much like Socratic dialectic and Platonic dialogues. You have Socratic dialectic presumably going on in the marketplace and in Plato's Academy. And then when it is written down for posterity or teaching or what have you, or dissemination, then it turns into something slightly different, slightly more formal perhaps, but still containing many of the same elements. And so that's a lot of what we see here with Aquinas as well in the form of writing a scholastic disputation. So what you're going to notice first is that he goes about introducing the topic in such a way that it makes clear what is at stake, what the topic is, why it's important, and what has been said about it. So this more or less follows along with Aristotle's form in presenting in doxa first. So the respected opinions, the authorities, and by reporting on what it is that has previously been said, which is still, common practice today in academic articles now, we'll call this a lit review, right? So you go through, you review what has previously been said on the topic to show that you've done your homework, and also to set the discussion up, to set the scene properly. And to this does a couple of things, right? This introduces the topic. It helps to potentially educate your audience who may not have read, all of the same things that you have, and also prevents you from rehearsing arguments that have already been given, reinventing the wheel, so to speak, recreating something that is already a commonplace or something that's already been addressed, and instead pushing forward and trying to actually do something new and different. So that's a lot of what's going on. This is more or less the indoxa section of reviewing what it is that's been said before, how it is that people talk about evil. So he goes through a lot of these. And what I want to show you that this isn't captured in the translation, but praeterea, and further, and further, and further. So this is over and over again, and you can see if you were to write a formal essay and you began every paragraph with exactly the same phrase, We tend to think that that's not very interesting. It doesn't provide very much variety. But at the same time, it does structure the discussion in such a way that you know exactly what you're getting. And that was what they were interested in. Getting to the nuts and bolts of the philosophy, get to the real ideas and not so much concerned with rhetorical flourish. So this is to be understood perhaps in contrast to poetry in that way. Okay, so he goes about listing out all of the different things that have been said, and then says, sed contra. On the contrary, I say, or in this case, on the contrary, Augustine says, etc., etc. So Augustine, of course, is a respected authority, and he comes out very quickly and within the first phrase says, evil is not a nature, but that the lack of good took on this description. So the lack of good, so evil as a privation of good. You know immediately where he stands. This is very cut and dry, to the point, almost in syllogistic fashion. Here's my first point, here's my second. So here's the source that I am drawing from. Evil is a privation of good. Here's some scriptural evidence for that sort of thing. Again, an appeal to authority, showing of certain, not just proof texts, but biblical support for the idea, so that you can explain evil by way of what Augustine has said, appeal to his arguments, his ideas, his authority, and then also the authority of Scripture and revealed wisdom. So we have different forms of goodness that can be provided, evidence more or less. This is not the sort of thing that people typically do today, but it depends upon the forum. If it's a recognizably religious forum, then this thing is still perfectly current. So you have a brief exposition there, and then finally a fuller explanation of exactly what his stance is, again appealing to certain authorities where it's helpful, and fully fleshing out the ideas. And then finally, after his stance is made clear, replying to the individual objections. The emphasis all the time should be on how does the argument work? How precisely should we understand what has been said and what follows from that? Because a lot of what goes on in scholastic disputation is trying to understand the consequences of a particular argument, what is entailed by what has been previously said. And if I can get that person to then agree to something that is logically entailed by what they have said, but that's either absurd or involves something that they don't want to assent to, then the argument begins to unravel. And so this is when you see, winners and losers. So a disputation, disputatio, simply means a debate, an argument, or a discussion. And fundamentally, it's a game. And like many games, just as with the ones that we play, we often use the metaphorics of war. So you have an attacker, opponens, and a defender, defendens. Or, in the older system of terminology, opponens and respondens. So the person who puts forth a claim and attacks, and then the person who responds, who answers to that claim. And there are rules to the game, and the rules to the game more or less correspond with what you would expect given syllogistic reasoning. So the opponens begins by saying, pono tibi some proposition, positio. So I put forth to you that you should endorse some position. Or the opposite, depono tibi some position, depositio. So I propose that you deny a particular position. And to take an example, one that we're not going to use so as to avoid more commonplace arguments, the existence of God. So you could say, I put forth to you that you should endorse the claim that God exists, or I put forth to you that you should deny the claim that God exists. And to this, the respondens, who has the more difficult of the positions, arguably, has several possibilities. He can say, concedo, yes, I concede this, I admit it, admitto, or I deny it, nego, or dubito, distinguo. So I doubt it, or I will ask for further distinction. And the latter of these two basically picks upon a particular term. So we might say, I put forth to you that you should endorse the idea that God exists. And the defendens or respondens might say, dubito or distinguo. I need a further distinction. What do you mean by God? And so then it would be up to the other side to specify something, put forth a claim that can then be, again, subject to the same admission, denial, or asking for further clarification. And this is more or less a formalized structure of what it is that we naturally do in arguments. So someone puts forth a claim, and we either say, yeah, I agree with that, or no, I definitely disagree with that, if the terms of the claim are already clear. However, if there's an ambiguity, if something is unclear, and oftentimes this is the source of disagreement in many philosophic debates, then you ask for clarification. And you get something that is agreed upon by both sides. You make little steps of incremental progress, saying, oh yes, okay, I agree with this, I disagree with that, and fine-tuning the positions, the claims, until finally you have a string of these claims, and they either stump the attacker or the respondent arrives at a contradiction. So this is the nature of one or the other side winning. And that's basically how these work. Okay, so let's take a look at a particular example. The last example that Angelelli mentions in his article starts like this. The respondent states the theme, states the subject or topic, thema. If a person is wise, then that person is free. And the opponent responds by saying, A2 and A3 imply not A1. There exists a person who is a slave and is wise. And then A3, if a person is a slave, then that person is not free. Here, the respondent replies, distinguo. In other words, I need clarification. There is an ambiguity in what you're saying. Distinguo, free, liber, in A3. So in other words, I'm looking for more information on what you mean by free. For freedom of the body, concedo, I agree. For freedom of the mind, nego. To this, the opponent responds, A4, A5, the conjunction of A4 and A5 implies A3. So, I claim, if someone is free, that person can live as he wants. And, if someone is a slave, that person cannot live as he wants. These imply A3. If someone is a slave, then that person is not free. To this, the defendant responds, nego A3. I deny A3. I deny your claim that if someone is a slave, then that person is not free. And I do this by asserting A8 with 6, 7, and 2. So for A8, I assert that someone is a slave and can live as he wants. And I do this by A6. If someone is wise, then that person wants to live according to reason. A7, if someone wants to live according to reason, he can live as he wants. And A2, which was previously used by the opponent, there is someone who is a slave and is also wise. I claim that someone can be a slave and also be wise. To this, the opponent responds, A9, and A9 implies not A6. So A9, someone is wise who controls his passions. This implies not A6, where A6 is if someone is wise, then that person wants to live according to reason. So, if someone is wise and controls his passions, then this implies that this person is not going to be passionate about controlling his reason. That seems to be what's said here. To this, the defendant responds, nego A9, and asserts A10. So, he says, I deny that it's the case that those who are wise control their passions, and instead assert that if someone does not control his passions, then that person is not wise, which is a different claim. To this, the opponent responds, I prove A9 from history, Aristotle is an example. And at this point, the defendant has him and says, proofs from history are not sufficient. In other words, you've broken the rules, I win. So I would wager that this example probably struck you in one of two ways. Either, wow, that's confusing, or that's a really convoluted way of saying something simple. Okay, so let's take this out of logical notation and bring it back into English. This is how this game might have gone down. A wise man is free. A man can be both slave and wise, but a slave is not free. What do you mean by free? For freedom of the body, I agree. For freedom of the mind, I don't. A free man can live as he wants. A slave cannot live as he wants. Thus, a slave is not free. I deny that a slave is not free. A man can be a slave and live as he wants. A man who is wise will want to live according to reason. A man who wants to live according to reason can live as he wants. A wise man controls his passions. This implies that it isn't true that a wise man wants to live according to reason. I deny that a wise man controls his passions. Instead, if a man does not control his passions, he is not wise. I prove that a wise man controls his passions by pointing to Aristotle. Proofs from history are not sufficient. Tempus cadet. Time to give up.